I want to dive right in today with a sort of a prologue. I'll get back to the question of what is poly and why are we talking about a polysphere and so on. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to do a kind of a prologue first. The question today is what is Theravada Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism, what we usually call Theravada Buddhism, that's the Buddhism that's today largely practiced in Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Laos. And why did those places come together with one kind of Buddhism? If we can say one kind of Buddhism, because of course that's an issue. So the big question is about the connections across the Bay of Bengal between Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia. And with that in mind, I want for us to be tourists for a moment. So here's a tourist picture of the so-called Temple of the Emerald Buddha in Bangkok, the main royal Buddhist temple in Bangkok. And we're going to be, please imagine for a few moments that we are Sri Lankans in 1920, and we've come to Bangkok and we're visiting this temple. This is our first time in Thailand, and we're visiting this temple. Actually, all of the rest of you are first-timers. I've been in Bangkok before, so I've heard some stuff that I'm going to tell you, my fellow Sri Lankans. But we're all Sri Lankans, and we're going to this most important Buddhist temple in Bangkok. And the question is, what seems familiar in some ways? What can we recognize? What can we figure out and see as part of our tradition? And what is not familiar? So here we are, and we see some Thai Buddhist monks first off, so that's reassuring. And the robes that a Sri Lankan monk would wear and the robes that a Thai monk would wear are related and perfectly recognizable. Then we'd head for the main building in which the great famous Buddha image, the so-called Emerald Buddha, is enshrined. So we're heading for this building. At the corners, we see these little shrine things, and inside them there are see these. There's a pair of stone slabs inside there. This is a much older temple, just to show you what these slabs look like. I think unfamiliar from the Sri Lankan Buddhist point of view, but if someone tells us that they're marking off the sacred space inside which ordinations can take place, then that makes sense, because in Sri Lanka, as I understand it also, the space or the building where ordinations are performed has to be demarcated or thought of as a specially sacred space. So even though the form may not be familiar, the idea of bounding off the sacred space inside which ordinations can take place, that concept is familiar. Then we approach the front of the building and go in, and clearly it doesn't look like Sri Lankan architecture and Sri Lankan sculpture and Sri Lankan painting much at all. And one of the things that we need to think about today is type versus style. So usually the styles between Thailand, the kingdoms in Thailand, the kingdoms in Myanmar, Burma, the kingdoms in Sri Lanka, the kingdoms in Cambodia and Laos, their styles will be different, but sometimes the type, the underlying idea, is similar. So here, if we could see them, as a visitor, and it's not easy to see, but on the back wall is the Mount Meru cosmic system, and we would be familiar with that cosmic geography as Sri Lankan Buddhists. And on the side walls are scenes from the life of the Buddha, and those, of course, would be familiar to us. The idea of having a very important Buddha image in the center is very familiar and recognizable. But what are these? And we'll come back to this image later. There's some things that are recognizable about it from the Sri Lankan point of view, and a lot of things that are not recognizable. So we'll come back to that. Then we go back outside and we see a stupa, and we can, from the Sri Lankan point of view, we can immediately recognize that this is a stupa. It's enough like some Sri Lankan stupas in form that we can recognize it. But then we see another one, and we're told that it too is a stupa, but the appearance of it is completely different, and it's held up on the hands of these demons. So what on earth is that about from the point of view of a Sri Lankan visitor? And then we see another row of monuments, and they are, I think, completely unfamiliar. Very, very difficult to place in the context of the kind of Buddhism and Buddhist architecture and Buddhist art that a Sri Lankan visitor would be familiar with. So then I, who've been here before and heard something about this, will say these have to do with connections with ancient Angkor, with ancient Cambodia. And the memory of ancient Angkor, the memory of ancient Cambodia, continued to be strong in Thailand through the centuries and into the 20th century. And that's what these have to do with. And that's part of the reason that this would be completely unfamiliar to a Sri Lankan visitor. Then we approach another one of the main buildings, and again, the style of it is not familiar. We go upstairs and up the stairs, and on the platform we see these fantastic creatures, and they will not, I think, immediately seem familiar to a Sri Lankan visitor. But if somebody explains that these are the fantastic animals that inhabit the Himavanta forest, the great mythological forest that's on the slopes of Mount Meru, can this light just came on. Can you turn it down? Thanks. These are representations of some of the fantastic animals that live in the Himavanta forest on the slopes of Mount Meru. So if you explain that, if a Thai person explained that to a Sri Lankan visitor, I think the Sri Lankan visitor would say, yes, I know about that idea, even though I've never seen anything that looked like this before. But then when you go inside this building, and it's only open once a year, so you'd have to be there on the right day. When you go inside this building, in this main Buddhist temple in Bangkok, there are statues of the royal ancestors. These are the previous kings of the dynasty. So from the Sri Lankan point of view, you would say, why are royal ancestors, the previous kings of the dynasty, why are they enshrined in this very elaborate building in a Buddhist temple? So we'll leave that question hanging for the moment, but this is something that will not seem, I think, familiar to a Sri Lankan visitor. Then we approach the surrounding sort of gallery that goes all the way around the building, flanked by these guardians. The idea of guardians on either side of a gateway or a doorway would be familiar to a Sri Lankan visitor. But when you find out, when you're told that these particular ones are demons from the Rama epic, from the Ramayana, it, I think, will seem strange from a Sri Lankan point of view to have demons from the Rama epic in this protective role in a Buddhist temple. And of course, it gets more baffling from the Sri Lankan point of view, I think, when you go inside here and you find that all the walls in this gallery are covered with murals depicting the Rama epic. So why is the Rama epic featured so prominently in a Buddhist temple? Puzzling question, an important one that we'll come back to. So that's the prologue. Please keep some of those ideas in mind. And please keep in mind the general question of when we're looking at different kingdoms in Myanmar, different kingdoms in Thailand, different kingdoms in Sri Lanka, what is in common through the kind of Buddhism that is to some extent shared, and what is not in common. That's going to be a primary theme today. So do think about the map of the Bay of Bengal. I've marked some of the key places, and I think you, in last term and this term lecture series, I think we've been reminded over and over and over, and it's very important, that the oceans were dividers in some sense, but they were also very, very important links. And so we need to not think of the ocean as being an insuperable barrier between different places. And certainly the Bay of Bengal was, in a sense, like the Mediterranean in European history. People were going back and forth and around it all the time, and there was lots of interchange in trade, in travel, in pilgrimage, in occasionally warfare, going back and forth across the Bay of Bengal. And I say across, but I think most of the time, if you were going from Martaban in southern Burma, if you wanted to get from there to Sri Lanka, most of the time you don't go straight across, because we're talking about early ships and so on. So you'd tend to go along the coast, because with early ships, I'm told, and everywhere in the world, I understand that early on mariners tended to want to stay within sight or pretty close to within sight of land rather than going across the open sea. You can see these places that I put on here, Martaban, Fatone, and they've all got new names. As you know, the government of Myanmar not only changed the name of the country from Burma to Myanmar, but has changed the names of lots of cities, or at least changed the spelling of the names of lots of cities. So Bago here is what we used to call Pegu, and in almost any book you look at that's more than 5 years old, you'll see Pegu, and you need to know that that's now called Bago, and so on. I haven't routinely given all of the new names. I've mostly used the ones that you'd find in historical sources. Anyway, these places are on the coast, obviously, and near where you could get a boat and go along to another part of the coast. And places like Fatone here and Martaban were very important for reaching Ayutthaya in central Siam, Sukhothai, which I didn't mark on here but is very important, in north-central Siam, Chiang Mai in northern Siam, very, very important. And so if you were going from Sri Lanka to Chiang Mai, you'd go along the coast and end up at Fatone or Martaban, and then you'd go overland the rest of the way. So these were ports for the great cities of the Siamese kingdoms, the Thai kingdoms, as well as for the kingdoms in Myanmar. Keep in mind, and I've marked it in a different color, keep in mind Bodh Gaya, because if we're thinking of an area of the world that shares the Pali language, and I'm going to come back to Pali language in a minute, we're thinking of an area of the world that shares the Pali language as a sacred ecclesiastical language, like in a way Latin was in the European Middle Ages. They share Pali as a sacred language. They share many features of certain kinds of Buddhism that are completely different from the Buddhism of China and Tibet and Korea and Japan. And they share some other cultural things too. So the places that share those things are the little purple stars, but Bodh Gaya, the site of the Buddha's enlightenment, of the Mahabodhi temple, continues to be very important in ways that I'll mention, even though, in a sense, it's outside of, strictly speaking, what you might think of as the Pali language, Theravada Buddhist world. Now, if you look at a textbook, you find a map like this that says China, Korea, Japan have Mahayana Buddhism, Tibet and Mongolia have Vajrayana Buddhism, and Sri Lanka, Burma, Myanmar, Thailand, Siam, Laos, Cambodia have Theravada Buddhism. This is the three-way division that we've all known of. Needless to say, the situation is much, much, much more complicated than this. And there's problems with all of these words, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. And there's great problems with the idea of dividing Buddhisms up into three categories. Do look, I recommended to you on your handout, a quite recent good survey of Buddhism that's called Buddhisms. And that's very important these days, to speak of Buddhisms and not Buddhism as a singular thing. Anyway, the situation is much more complicated than this, as you'll see as we go along, of monks going back and forth between the kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. And in the historical records, there's lots of these monastic monks' visits going back and forth on both sides. And one of the things that's very important to keep in mind is we need to not envision an arrow of influence going from India or Sri Lanka to mainland Southeast Asia, most particularly in the situation of Theravada Buddhism, what we're going to call for the moment Theravada Buddhism. There's lots of back and forth. After the Chola invasion of Sri Lanka in the 10th century, 11th century, when the Sri Lankans got the South Indian Cholas out and got their control of their own kingdom again, the Buddhist monkhood in Sri Lanka had fallen on very hard times, and there were no longer enough senior monks who had had the right kind of ordination to be able to constitute the quorum that was required to ordain new young monks. So they didn't have enough monks to perform the ordination ceremony for new monks. So they sent to southern Burma a kingdom that was inhabited by the Mon people, not Burmese, Mon. The Mon Mon language is distantly related to Cambodian. These are a people who were in were and still are to some extent in southern Thailand and southern Myanmar. The king of Sri Lanka sent to the Mon kingdom 4 monks to come back to Sri Lanka and perform ordinations. So this was happening in both directions at various times. And these monks, of course, were carrying texts with them. They're carrying paintings with them, probably. They may be carrying little sculptures with them back and forth. So so monks were moving, and they were taking with them artworks and artifacts of various kinds. They're certainly taking ideas back and forth, and it's definitely a back and forth that we need to keep in mind. About 1100, about 1350, about 1475, about 1753, single monks or groups of monks going one direction or the other between Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia to study, to look for texts, or because they've been summoned to perform ordinations. So now I can follow. Sorry for the disruption. I wanted to say that today, so there's the kind of Buddhism that's to some extent in common between Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia, was in Sri Lanka from very, very early on, and it was in mainland Southeast Asia, we know, from the 5th century, 6th century at least, this kind of Buddhism was existing. But today, not focusing on the early period, mainly focusing on the last 1,000 years today. So there's a lot of important early material, just not doing it today, but it's there. There's Buddha images, there's architecture, and so on and so on. But we're not addressing that today. Another thing, imagine if you will, hooray, there we are. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, cool. Thank you very much. So a reminder, yes, thank you. A reminder that maybe you've noticed I've continually been saying kingdoms. Century by century, there are, in mainland Southeast Asia, different kingdoms, and their borders are changing. Some are getting more powerful, some are getting less powerful. So we can't think of there being a Thailand or a Myanmar, and we can't think of there being a Sri Lanka either, because at various times Sri Lanka was divided up among various kingdoms. And I'm not going to go into this today, but just please keep in mind that Sri Lanka was not a unified thing, Myanmar was not a unified thing, Thailand, Siam was not a unified thing. So, for example, the northern Thai kingdom centered on Chiang Mai was very important in this back and forth with Sri Lanka. Here's the Mon kingdom. Here it's called Hantawadi. That's an old name. This is the Mon kingdom in southern Burma. Very important at times, and then later it lost power and kind of disappeared from the map. Now, Pali, let me say it has nothing to do with the Pala dynasty of northeastern India. No connection at all, okay? Pali is an ancient Indic language closely related to Sanskrit. Closely related to Sanskrit. So here they are. This is the Indo-European language tree. So Pali and Sinhala, the language that most people in Sri Lanka today speak, always have spoken and still speak today. Sinhala is related to Pali, and both of them are distantly related to English. They're Indo-European languages. This is important to keep in mind. Both Pali and Sinhala, the common spoken and written language of Sri Lanka today, they're related to each other, and they're both Indo-European languages, so they're distantly related to English. Pali is close to Sanskrit, and you'll see words that are almost spelled the same, but not quite. So here's the Sanskrit ones, and at the Asian Art Museum, we tend to use the Sanskrit spellings all the time, even in Pali contexts, just so that the public doesn't have to keep track of two different sets of spelling. But these are the Pali spellings and Sanskrit spellings. So Pali and Sinhala, are both Indo-European and related to each other. The other big areas where the kind of Buddhism that we're going to be talking about today in the so-called Pali sphere, none of them are in the same language family as Pali or Sinhalese, and they're not in the same language family as each other. So the language issues are very complicated in thinking about this kind of Buddhism and the culture related to it. But all of these are using Pali for their sacred, scriptural, and language for monastic ceremonies and so on, for chanting. But of course, hardly anybody in any of these places knows Pali. Only monks who have studied and studied and studied know Pali. So very few lay people in any of these places know more than a few words of Pali, just as the average French person in 1400 didn't know much Latin. They may know a few words and a few phrases that they've heard at church, but other than that, they don't know Latin. What about written Pali? Well, here's some written Pali. The great, another challenge is Pali is a language that does not have a writing system that goes with it. It's written in whatever is the script of the place where it's used. And sometimes even within one place, it's written in several different scripts. So here's a manuscript from Thailand where Pali is written in a version of the Cambodian script. So the manuscript is made in Thailand. It's in Pali language, but it's in a script closely related to Cambodian. Here's another page of the same manuscript made in Thailand in the middle of the 19th century. It's also in Pali language, but here it's written in the Mon writing system. So most Thai people, regular Thai people, can't read, well, they can't read the underlying language, and they can't read the writing system because Thai people mostly don't know the Mon writing system, and mostly they don't know the Cambodian writing system either. So it's pretty challenging. And a question that maybe Pat will know the answer to this. Somebody's got to tell us the answer to this. When a Thai or Burmese monk went to Sri Lanka, or a Sri Lankan monk went to Thailand or Burma, what language did they speak together? They didn't have a language in common. Did they speak Arabic? Did they speak Chinese? No, really. I mean, what language might they have? Nobody speaks Pali. And a Sri Lankan monk going to Thailand can see a manuscript that's written in Pali, but he can't read the script. He could read the language, but he can't read the script. So this is a real challenge. Think about this. So the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In principio creavit Deus caelum et terram. So in medieval Europe, to read this, you had to have Latin. But at least it's written in the same alphabet as you're familiar with for French or English or Italian. At least the writing system is familiar, even if the underlying language is not. I was trying to think of an example to show you this, the challenge. And this was the closest I could come. It's still the Roman alphabet, but it's not so easy for us to read in principio creavit Deus caelum, abbreviated, et terram. We can read it, but it's challenging. Instead of being a different font, what if it was a different writing system altogether? So even though you knew Latin, you couldn't read the script that it was written in. Challenge. Now, here's the so-called Pali Canon. And let me say, we're not going to talk about this anymore. I'm just showing you this as a suggestion of the complexity of talking about the Pali Canon. Canon in the sense of the group of accepted religious texts that everyone agrees are the key religious texts for our kind of Buddhism. The Tripitaka, so-called, the three baskets of texts divided into three groups that Buddhists in Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia would be familiar with. And there's a lot of the texts that are in common and that are shared, but around the edges, there are other texts that some lineages say are part of the canon and other lineages say are not part of the canon. So what the Pali Canon is in general is agreed to, but in specific, there's not necessarily agreement in specifics. What does it look like? Well, you've seen these before. This was an old-fashioned book written on palm leaf where the writing is scratched into the surface of the palm leaf, and then lampblack soot is rubbed across it to darken it. So it's closed on the top and open on the bottom. And then in Thailand in particular, there's another kind of manuscript. This is a Pali language manuscript, accordion fold style manuscript. And so these would be being taken around from various kingdoms in Thailand, Siam, to Myanmar, Burma, to Sri Lanka, and so on. These actual texts would be taken. Another thing to keep in mind is that these religious texts are important for texts, and they're important for reading or reciting from sometimes, but they're also important as objects. And often, even if you can't read it, even if nobody in your kingdom could really read it, it's still important as a sacred object. So these books are revered for their objectness as well as for their contents. Now, another format, this is incising, pressing into strips of gold. And this one, 5th century from Pegu, this place in the Mon country of southern Burma. This is the earliest surviving inscription in Pali, period. So the earliest surviving inscription in Pali is from southern Burma, southern Myanmar, and not from Sri Lanka. And in fact, Pali was used for inscriptions a lot in mainland Southeast Asia and hardly ever in Sri Lanka. Why is that? Why are there inscriptions in Pali in mainland Southeast Asia from very early on and hardly ever any in Sri Lanka? This is a question that I don't think anybody knows the answer to. It's just a fact that we have not figured out yet. There was also a tradition of writing the entire group of canonical books on stone inscriptions. And this is a famous one from a temple in mid-19th century Upper Burma, Upper Myanmar, where there's each one of these buildings, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of them. Each one has a big stone slab like this with part of the Pali scriptures, the Pali Canon, written on it. So people were very concerned about making sure that it isn't lost. One of the issues in Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia have often, big parts of them, rather tropical climates. It's hot, it's wet, there's plenty of insects. So manuscripts and paintings and so on are getting destroyed all the time, or they're being destroyed in fires. So preserving them, it becomes a very important issue. So one way to do that is to inscribe them on stone. Now, this is just a reminder that Pali is used for other kinds of works besides religious works. Here's what essentially is a kind of partly mythological, partly historical history work written in one of the northern Thai kingdoms in Pali early on. So keep in mind that there is some Pali literature, particularly things like royal chronicles and historical works. There are works in Pali, written in Pali, besides religious works. So this one is from there. It's from Chiang Mai. So in the 1500s, there are enough learned northern Thai monks whose Pali is good enough that they can write elaborate historical books in Pali. And of course, one of the advantages of Pali, or Sanskrit in other contexts, or Latin in the European context, is that it is usable from country to country. If you can get over the script problem, there's monks who can read Pali in various kingdoms in Burma and in Sri Lanka and in Thailand and so on. So it at least opens up the possibility of some cross-cultural communication. Now, Theravada Buddhism, this term, means tradition of the elders. We use it a lot these days. One of the problems with the term is it seems to have been essentially invented at the very end of the 19th century and was not used by Theravada Buddhists for themselves until 1950. So it's not a term that has any history in the tradition. We use it nowadays because we need a term of convenience. A distinction used to be made between Southern Buddhism and Northern Buddhism. In other words, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia was Southern Buddhism. China, Japan, Tibet were Northern Buddhism. That used to be made. That distinction was let go of, but just recently, some religious studies scholars have started using the term Southern tradition again because they're so uncomfortable with the term Theravada that they're looking for something else to name the phenomenon that we're trying to talk about. What we used to be told is that this type of Buddhism, the Buddha is supposed to have visited Sri Lanka. This is the tradition. Monks came from the Buddhist areas of India to Sri Lanka very early on, and then a very important lineage, very important tradition was started in Sri Lanka and continued ever after and was eventually shared in Southeast Asia. What we were told was that it represented the earliest traditions of Buddhism. It was, in fact, if you look at things written 70 years ago, you can see it called primitive Buddhism. It was supposed to be the very earliest tradition. Well, and then maybe you remember this book, maybe you've seen this book, 1959. It was a book I read early on. You may have done so too. Scholars nowadays would say this, and I'll let you read it. Any attempt at delineating what early Buddhism was, and still more what the Buddha taught, are fantasies. Because the texts, the earliest surviving texts, are 300, 400, 500, maybe even more, hundreds of years than that after the Buddha's life. And they had already gone through, by the time they were written down, they were being written down at a monastery or a group of monasteries, and that group of monasteries had their point of view, of course. And so what was preserved, what was written down, was already being edited very early on. And so most scholars these days would say we cannot get back to the earliest phases of Buddhism because the evidence doesn't survive. When we're talking about religion, please keep in mind there's at least three big categories of stuff that we should be thinking about. Doctrines, what are the beliefs that we're supposed to follow and that are written down in the canon and that the monastics preach and so on, the doctrines. Then the practices, and the practices are related to the doctrine sometimes, and sometimes they're not related to the practices. This is rituals, it's ceremonies for ordination, but then what about funerals? What about marriages? What about coming of age rituals and so on? The reverence for relics. Under practices, we'd put ideas like magic amulets and shirts that protect you from bullets, because there's been a lot of this kind of thing in Buddhism from very early on. Still in Bangkok today, there's a huge market for amulets that have different kinds of powers, and you can go to the amulet market and you can buy a supposedly Buddhist amulet that will help you win the lottery, or it will protect you from gunshots, or, does all kinds of stuff for you. And this has always been there, the kind of protective, cure your ills, make you win the lottery kind of stuff that's going on in the realm of practice. And then, of course, the whole range of artifacts, the whole range of material culture. So back to the map, another complexity with this map is all of these red countries, supposedly Theravada, they do have a lot of things in common in their religious traditions, but Mahayana Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism that's now in China, Korea, Japan, and so on, existed in all of these places early on, so they were never a solid red. They always had some yellow pockets too, and Hinduism continued to exist to some extent in all of these places. And so it was never, you come to the border of, you come to that border right there and you change your religion. It was never that. It was always complicated. And if you look at some of the greatest artworks from Sri Lanka, they are Mahayana Buddhist and not Theravada Buddhist. So just keep in mind that early on, what's more beautiful than this in the world? Some of the greatest Buddhist artworks from Sri Lanka relate to Mahayana Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism in China and so on, rather than to Theravada. What we'll be looking at the rest of the time today is Theravada, though. So, what's in common? Well, a focus on the Buddha Shakyamuni, the so-called historical Buddha, focus on him and his life. That's in common. And so in 18th century Siam, we can see recognizable, familiar depictions of the birth of the Buddha. Here's his mother standing up, holding onto a tree, as the ancient traditions have it, and she's attended by her ladies. Here's Brahma and here's Indra, who are coming along, and actually the baby is being held by Brahma. Brahma is recognizable by his three faces. Brahma and Indra are gods in Hinduism, but they're also gods in Buddhism. So we need to not think of these as Hindu gods who have somehow moved into Buddhism. They have been part of Buddhist traditions since the very beginning. The earliest Buddhist texts talk about some supposedly Hindu deities like Indra and Brahma. They're subsidiary to the Buddha. They are not immortal as they would be in a Hindu context. They have lifespans. Their lifespans are, you know, 1 billion years, but they do have a lifespan. They're not going to live forever. But they're powerful, and they attend the Buddha, and we'll be seeing more of them. Then a painting from Sri Lanka during the period when the young prince Siddhartha is achieving enlightenment, and just after, you remember, he's tempted by the beautiful daughters of the demon Mara. So the life of the Buddha, the life of the so-called historical Buddha, in all of its mythological ramifications, is commonly known and thought of as being very important in Sri Lanka and Myanmar and Thailand and Laos and Cambodia. Also, there's a concept of the Buddhas of the past and the future. So here's 5. One of the sets, sometimes you get 28 Buddhas of the past and the present in the Theravada Buddhist world. Sometimes you get 5. Here are 5. So 3 of these are Buddhas of the past. One is Shakyamuni, the Buddha of our present period, and the 5th one is Maitreya, the figure who will become the next Buddha. So there is a concept of Buddhas of the past and the future, but there's only one Buddha at a time. In Mahayana Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism, you can have multiple Buddhas in multiple universes simultaneously. In the Theravada world, you only have one Buddha at a time. There's been Buddhas of the past, there will be Buddhas of the future, but only one at a time. Here's Maitreya. This is a 19th century painting in the Asian Art Museum collection of Maitreya, the now Bodhisattva who will become the next Buddha, and he's quite important in both in Sri Lanka and Burma, Cambodia, Thailand. Just to remind you of the importance of Maitreya, here's an important Buddhist cave temple in Sri Lanka with, obviously, a Buddha image, and right next to him is Maitreya. And you can't see it, but there is a little Buddha in the headdress of Maitreya, as we usually expect for images of the Bodhisattva Maitreya. So in this so-called Theravada context, we do find Maitreya importantly, but we don't find other bodhisattvas like Manjushri and Avalokiteshvara and so on. They are not there. There's Buddhas of the past, there's a Buddha of the future. Our own Buddha, the so-called historical Buddha, of course, lived many lives before he achieved Buddhahood. Those are the Jataka stories, of which there are over 500. The last 10 become particularly important in mainland Southeast Asia. Here's a painting in the Asian Art Museum collection that shows vignettes from the last 10 Jatakas. And then, you know, the very last one, the last earthly life of the so-called historical Buddha, the very next to the last one before he's born on earth is the Vessantara Jataka, and it's very, very important in Theravada Buddhist context. And we see it early on, for instance, here in Cambodia in the 13th century. That's Vessantara and his 2 children. You remember the story. He's a prince who is perfecting the virtue of flawless generosity, and so he's asked for his kingdom's great elephant. He's asked for his horses and his chariot. He's eventually asked for his children. He's asked for his wife, and he gives them all away because he's perfectly generous. So here he is about to give away the children, and I think what's going on here is that he's giving away his wife. Here's an 18th century Thai painting from a manuscript of the same thing. So here's Vessantara and his wife carrying two children, their two children, before he's given them away. From Sri Lanka, painting of the Vessantara Jataka, where this is the Bodhisattva, and he's giving away the elephant. I haven't put these in chronological order. I wanted to put them chronological order of the story. I wanted to organize them geographically. Here's the prince giving away his kingdom's magical elephant. He's giving it away by pouring water on the hands of the people who have asked for it. That's a gesture of giving. So, the stories of the Buddha's past lives, most particularly the last one, the Vessantara Jataka, are very important and in common through the Theravada Buddhist world. And then just before break, I want to show you a couple of things about Buddha images. Here's a kind of a very beautiful sort of standard Sri Lankan Buddha image. And a couple of things to notice are the flame-shaped radiance jutting out of the top of the head, the legs that are laid on top of each other and not interlocked, the hands both in the lap in a gesture of meditation, and this long strip. This is a folded up third monk's robe that's laid over the shoulder, and we're seeing it here. So keep those in mind. In this particular one, we see the folds of the Buddha's robe, and that's pretty common in Sri Lanka and not common in mainland Southeast Asia. But there are examples from Sri Lanka like this one where the folds, the drapery of the monk's robe are not shown. So if we compare a Sri Lankan one and a Thai one, what they've got in common is the jet of flame coming out of the top of the Ushnisha. They've got in common the legs that are laid on top of each other and not interlocked. They've got in common this folded up third monk's robe that's laid over the shoulder. What they don't have in common is the hand position. And this is very fundamental. Most of the time in Sri Lanka, this is the hand position. And most of the time in mainland Southeast Asia, this is the hand position. So there's a lot of things in common, but one key thing, the hand position, that's not in common. And that hand position, of course, has to do with the victory over Mara that happens at the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya in northeastern India. And so the Buddha image from Thailand has this hand position in common with a Buddha image from northeastern India and not in common with a Sri Lankan Buddha image. And this theme of continuing connections in Southeast Asia with the Bodh Gaya, the Mahabodhi temple where the Buddha achieved enlightenment, continued connections, continued interest in mainland Southeast Asia with Bodh Gaya, in contrast to what's going on in Sri Lanka. That will be a continuing theme. And just to remind you where we're talking about. So, and how do these ideas get back and forth? Well, here's one dated, provable example. Wat Ratchabarana, one of the great temples in the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya. You've heard about it before in this lecture series. It had a very important crypt full of religious objects, full of religious objects. that was opened some decades ago. This crypt was sealed in 1424, so it's a kind of a time capsule because everything that was found in there had been put in there before 1424. And among the things found in that crypt in central Thailand is a Buddha image from Sri Lanka. It's absolutely Sri Lankan style. There's many more like this in Sri Lanka. It's not like the local style at all. So Buddha images themselves are being moved around and carried. This one in real life is quite small. It wouldn't be hard to put it in your coat pocket and carry it around. So objects themselves are being moved back and forth. Before I go on, I wanted to clarify two things that I was asked during the break. The Mon language and the Mon people, M-O-N, no relationship with H-M-O-N-G at all. No, I mean, it's a good question, but there's no relation. They're completely different languages, completely different cultures, completely different ethnic background. So I'm talking about M-O-N, not H-M-O-N-G, okay? That's one thing. The other thing somebody asked about was greater and lesser vehicles. Mahayana and Hinayana, lesser vehicle. Those words were invented, the term lesser vehicle was invented by Mahayanists to downgrade and insult Theravada Buddhists. So please don't use it. It has to do with inter-cult rivalries, inter-tradition rivalries, and so on. And so to say, oh, you're the lesser vehicle, obviously it's embarrassing. And there's no historical, well, I say there's no, I don't know how, Pat will have to tell us how old the term Hinayana is and when it's attested from, because I don't know the answer. The term Hinayana is attested. So Mahayanists are downgrading Theravadins already by the 5th century. So it's an ancient tradition. Okay. As you know, in American traditions, Quaker was an insult early on, and later it so there's various terms that people have used for those other folks whose religion is not proper. Okay, so the focus on Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, Buddha images, and then of course relics are extremely important because Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, is gone from the earth, and we believing Buddhists are left without any connection with him because he's gone. And so Buddha images were a means of creating a sense of connection, but even more important was relics. Here's the famous tooth relic. This is enshrined in the Temple of the Tooth Relic in Kandy in Sri Lanka. And it is thought to be a tooth of the historical Buddha in this gold stupa-shaped reliquary. Very, very, very important. And the question of relics, please keep it in mind because it's a key one. Relics were taken back and forth among these kingdoms, or sometimes they went on their own. True relics of the Buddha can fly, and they can do a lot of other things that you wouldn't expect. And so sometimes they went under their own propulsion from Sri Lanka to northern Thailand, for instance, and sometimes they were brought, and I should say they were invited by monks traveling back and forth. Very important to remember that in the languages of Buddhist Southeast Asia, you don't take a Buddha image any place, and you don't take a relic any place. You invite it, and it comes along if it pleases to do so, but you have to invite it very reverently, and then it will accompany you if it chooses to. Here's another supposed tooth relic. that was traveling around Southeast Asia. This is in Myanmar a few years ago. And you can see that it's being received with great ceremony by government officials. And then, again, the same. This is a hair relic that was visiting Thailand. And here's the current Prime Minister of Thailand carrying it. So when relics come to your place, they are received with the greatest honor, and they're received by kings or prime ministers. It has to do with the status of the government and so on. Because if a relic comes to your place, it means that it does not object to the government that you're conducting. So it's, it reinforces your authority. We have a number of reliquaries in the Asian Art Museum collection. Here's one from late 19th century Thailand. Would not have been for a relic of the Buddha, but relics are preserved for great monks and lesser monks, and sometimes regular people too. And this kind of reliquary is one that you might put the ashes of your deceased parent in, or something like that. It opens up, so there's a chamber inside that you can put ashes in. Then stupas. Stupas, of course, are reliquaries. So they are big architectural-sized reliquaries for enshrining a relic of the Buddha or of a very holy monk or something, often the Buddha, if possible. This is a famous one in Sri Lanka. And notice that it's approximately hemispherical, but with the beginnings of a kind of a bell shape. Then its throne component, platform component, is approximately cubical. What used to be very, very early on were understood to be tiered parasols have fused into a ribbed cone. So those are important characteristics of Sri Lankan stupas, and we'll look at those with some Southeast Asian ones in a minute. Just a reminder, though, this stupa has been completely reconstructed. This is what it was like in the 19th century. So we have to be careful all the time in looking at Buddhist monuments, I think all over, certainly in Southeast Asia and in Sri Lanka, that they have been restored and restored and restored and restored, so that often you are not at all confident that what you're seeing is close to the original. In this instance, it probably is, but just keep this in mind, how much it has changed. And the whole superstructure had fallen off. Now, here's a gigantic one. I wanted to show you some gigantic stupas, because gigantic stupas were a kind of specialty of Theravada Buddhism. Here's a gigantic stupa in central Myanmar, and it doesn't have the superstructure and the cone, and so it's possible that when this one was built in the 17th century, it's possible that they were using this as a model, the already partly ruined Sri Lankan one, so the one in Myanmar ends up not having the superstructure. Then this is also gigantic one in central Thailand near the coast, and was rebuilt in the middle of the 19th century. But the idea of a gigantic, truly huge stupa, and they're solid except for a relic chamber inside. They're solid masonry. These gigantic stupas turn up. There was a long tradition of them in Sri Lanka and in kingdoms in mainland Southeast Asia. Then later on, this is a Sri Lankan one, later on they become more and more sort of bell-shaped. We've still got the cubical square throne platform component, and then still have the fused cone at the top. And that kind of shape shows up. This is Ayutthaya in central Thailand in about the first half of the 15th century. Bell-shaped square element and fused ribbed cone for the upper part. And this shape then provides the model for the one we saw at the very beginning today in the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. So that's why this form, this rather bell-shaped form, in Thailand would probably be familiar to and recognizable by a person from Sri Lanka. And just as Buddha images traveled, so little miniature stupas. This one is maybe 10 inches, 9 or 10 inches high, very small. Reliquary, I'm sure it comes apart there, and you could put a relic inside. But these are small enough that they could be carried from place to place, and no doubt were carried from place to place. So the model of this, for instance, could be not only descriptions of monks who had been to Sri Lanka, but a small Sri Lankan miniature stupa that had found its way to Siam, possibly. Now, I wanted to talk again for a minute about the question of deities in Theravada Buddhist contexts. Here's the descent, the Buddha's descent from Tavatimsa heaven. Pat showed it in her and referred to it in her, not this piece, but to the idea in her lecture at the beginning of this term. The Buddha has gone to the heaven of the 33, Tavatimsa, Triyastrimshas, Indra's heaven, all the same thing. He's gone there to preach to his deceased mother and to the gods who live there. And then he descends back to earth. And there's a kind of a ladder. See the ladder here that he's using to descend. And as he descends, he's attended by Indra and Brahma. Here's Brahma with his 3 heads, quite recognizable. So the gods are in this role of attendants or supporters of the Buddha. Very, very high-level ones. So getting to do this, getting to carry the parasol over the Buddha when he descends from Tavatimsa heaven, you know, it's like being the Duke who had the privilege of handing Louis XIV his shirt in the morning. I mean, you'd think that handing the king his shirt was a kind of lowly task, but on the contrary, it is a very, very, very high task, and only high-ranking royal dukes would have the status to be able to hand Louis XIV his shirt in the morning. Here's a stucco relief of the same thing. So that one was from Pagan, one of the great kingdoms of Myanmar, Burma. Here's a representation in stucco on the side of a temple building of the same scene in Sukhothai in central Thailand, north central Thailand, 14th century one here. And again, the Buddha image is, the Buddha is descending these steps. Here's Indra, here's Brahma attending him as he descends. Here's a Sri Lankan ivory that is not necessarily the descent, but it does show the standing Buddha attended by Brahma and Indra. So the idea of these gods being around in Buddhist stories and attending the Buddha is quite common. Final one, here's a detail of a painting in the Asian Art Museum collection that shows the Buddha descending triple staircase that looks like a ladder here. He's descending and about to reach the earth, and attended by Indra, who is green in Thai tradition, and Brahma, who's white with 3 heads. So this tradition is a very common and well understood one in Sri Lanka, in the Burmese kingdoms, and in the Thai kingdoms. And just at the time, so there's between about 1350 and 1500. There's a particularly large number of monastic visits back and forth between Sri Lanka and the various kingdoms in mainland Southeast Asia between about 1350 and about 1500. Lots going back and forth. Just at this same time, when there's all these, we presume, very learned and orthodox monks going back and forth, just at the same moment in the kingdom of Sukhothai in north-central Thailand, which was very pious Theravada kingdom, are being cast enormous images of Shiva and Vishnu. So Shiva and Vishnu continue to be important in Theravada traditions in both Sri Lanka and the kingdoms of Thailand and the kingdoms of Burma. They may have had to do with royal ceremonies and so on. They may not have been specifically in religion, but we have to not think of the deities like Indra and Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva as disappearing or being unfamiliar, because they're not, but they're seen in a Buddhist context and understood in a Buddhist context rather than a so-called Hindu context. And here's a temple in Sri Lanka, Buddha image. Here's the deity that we normally think of as a Hindu deity, Skanda. Here's a South Indian Skanda in the Asian Art Museum with his peacock, and you see the peacock here again too. So this deity that in conventional terms you would think of as Hindu is in fact has a Buddhist personality and a Buddhist role too, and is here immediately flanking the Buddha image. Now, one of the most important and best surviving Sri Lankan temples of this period of 14th, 15th century is this one in the city of Gampola, which was a royal capital for a period during this time span. And I want to use it to show you a specific motif that does get picked up in Southeast Asia, that clearly starts in Sri Lanka and then gets picked up in mainland Southeast Asia. So here's the Buddha image inside this temple. And look at this sort of arched form over the Buddha image. I don't know if you can see, but there's a makara, a water creature, with its fancy tail, and here's its mouth. Here's another one, fancy tail and its mouth. Then there's this arch, and above the arch is a sort of monster face. So this is a approximately 1340s one. Here's a much later one in Sri Lanka that I show you only because it's clearer to see. So see the water creature, big fancy tail, projection going up here, and then monster face. Here's the central temple in the Thai capital of Sukhothai, built in this very same period, and it's got aquatic monster, big florid tail, mouth, archway with a little point in the middle, and then monster face over it, enclosing the parinirvana of the Buddha, a scene of the Buddha's passing away. So we know for sure this is one of the clearest examples we have of a motif that started in Sri Lanka, and in the same period that it was important in Sri Lanka, came to mainland Southeast Asia. There must have been paintings or drawings or carvings or something, because the similarity is so close that, or maybe artists were brought, who knows, but the similarity is very, very close. There's not many other examples where the similarity is so close. And there are instances where we can see motifs going the other direction too, where Southeast Asian artistic motifs are specifically being introduced into Sri Lanka. So those are things that we've seen are in common throughout the Pali sphere, the Theravada Buddhist world, and we can think of the part of the world where Pali is used as the religious language for Buddhism. For our purposes, we can think of that as corresponding to the world of Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism is associated with the Pali language, and Pali language is associated with Theravada Buddhism. There's a few exceptions, but on the whole, it works. So we've talked about some of the things that are in common, the focus on the historical Buddha and his life and his past lives and the future Buddha Maitreya, the lack of cosmic or savior bodhisattvas, and certain motifs and so on, and certain aspects of the Buddha image itself. Then what isn't in common? Well, the crowned Buddha image, which, as you know, is pretty common in both Myanmar, Burma, and Thailand, Siam, pretty common. Here's the great one in our collection that will be going back on view pretty soon. They exist in Angkor in Cambodia. Oops, sorry. Ignore the snake hoods for the moment. We're not going to get into that today. But just look at the idea of a Buddha image crowned and wearing other royal jewelry. So it exists in Angkor, in Buddhist contexts in Angkor, and then it continues to be used, the crowned Buddha image, with differing meanings. But the idea of a crowned and bejeweled Buddha image continues to be important in Thailand and in Myanmar, but not in Sri Lanka. And where you go back and find South Asian precedents for this is northeastern India, the area around Bodh Gaya, the Mahabodhi temple, the holy land of Buddhism, where quite early on there are Buddha images wearing crowns and royal jewelry. So this is an instance where a motif or a combination of motifs, a combination of ideas probably comes to the mainland Southeast Asian kingdoms from North India, because there were pilgrims and monks from Southeast Asia and North India going back and forth, northeastern India going back and forth too. So this is an idea that probably is not associated with Sri Lanka, but is associated with the Buddha's homeland in northeastern India. So here, all of these places have crowned and bejeweled Buddha images, and there are crowned and bejeweled Buddha images here, but not here. Now, going back to the Temple of the Emerald Buddha, here is the Emerald Buddha, and here it is close up. And it's an interesting mixture. It does wear a crown and royal jewelry, but as you perhaps know, it has 3 sets of jewelry, and the king himself changes the jewelry and the ornaments of this Buddha image 3 times a year. So they correspond to the seasons of the year, and this gold jewelry is taken off and replaced with a different set of gold fittings 3 times a year by the king. This is one of the seasons of the year has crown and other royal jewelry for the Buddha image. And so it's obviously very closely associated with the idea of kingship, and it's the king himself who puts this royal jewelry on the Buddha image. Anybody know what's, oh, thank you. Oh, okay, never mind, thank you. The so-called Emerald Buddha, it's not made of emerald, but it's made of something like, it's never been tested, so nobody knows exactly what it's made of. But it's made of some green stone, like some sort of jade thing, or some people say it's jasper. I don't know what jasper is, but anyway, we don't know exactly what it's made of, but it's stone. And you see, it's its hands are in the lap, not with the right hand on the right leg, as would be common in Thailand. And this image is thought, it has a legendary biography. It is thought to have been made in very ancient times in North India, and then it was taken to Sri Lanka, and it resided in Sri Lanka for a long time, and then it was brought to various places in Southeast Asia. So the so-called Emerald Buddha itself resided is thought to have resided for a long time in Sri Lanka, even though the idea of its eventually getting royal jewels would not be familiar. Some Sri Lankan monks who went to the Siamese kingdom in the middle of the 18th century recorded in their travel diaries that they were very puzzled by the idea of crowned Buddha images. This did not make any sense to them at all. Then another idea that is not in common is Prat Malai, this great pious monk who in Thai Buddhist tradition visits the hells and gives solace to the sufferers in hell, in the hells, and then he goes to Indra's heaven and worships the shrine of the Buddha's hair relic in Tavatimsa, the heaven of the 33 gods, Indra's heaven. And then he comes back to earth too. While he's in Indra's heaven, the heaven of the 33 gods, he is joined in worshiping the hair relic that's enshrined there. He's joined by Maitreya, the being who will become the next Buddha. And he then, Pramalai, this monk, comes back to earth and tells people that if they want to accumulate enough merit to be reborn on earth when Maitreya comes to earth, they should listen to a full recitation of the Vesantara Jataka, the story of the Buddha's last earthly life on earth. So the stories that go with Prat Malai bring together Indra's heaven, the hair relic that's enshrined there, Maitreya, the coming Buddha, and the Vesantara Jataka, all of which are extremely important. Here's a painting that you remember seeing a few months ago. It's now off view, but it was on view in our Southeast Asian galleries, a Cambodian painting of this same story. Here's Prat Malai in heaven. Here's Indra. This is the hair relic stupa. This is Indra. This is Prat Malai worshiping the hair relic monument in the heaven of the 33. And Indra has not, Maitreya has not come down to join them yet, but will in a minute. Then the Ramayana, you remember, I'm not going to go into this now, but the Ramayana, very important in mainland Southeast Asian Buddhist contexts and not in Sri Lanka. It has to do with, I think again, has to do with royal politics, because the kings of Cambodia and Siam and Burma often associated themselves with Vishnu, even though they're pious Buddhists, and Rama is an incarnation of Vishnu. So it has to do with royal courts using mythology to reinforce the position of the king. This is the ordination hall in an important temple in Bangkok. And you remember, you've seen these before, on the ordination hall of this Buddhist temple in Bangkok are scenes from the Ramayana, from the Rama epic. Here they are. And rubbings used to be made from them, and so this is what they look like. So it would be, I think it would be surprising for a Sri Lankan Buddhist to find the Rama epic featuring so prominently in Thai Buddhist context, or Burmese Buddhist context for that matter. And then here's a shrine, a household shrine, small shrine, that you would put Buddha images on for worship. It's got a crowned and bejeweled Buddha image on the back. This is in the Asian Art Museum collection. And when you look at the side, lo and behold, a scene from the Rama epic. This is the demon king Ravana battling Rama. So the Rama epic is in this very close mixture with Buddhist ideas. Now, I think I'm going to skip over this and come back to sum up a little bit. So what we've seen is that the idea of a world of a kind of Buddhism that's shared in a variety of places, and with Pali as the sacred language for that kind of Buddhism, it is largely important and real, but with many variations. And there are things in common, like the focus on the Buddha, only one Buddha at a time, the historical Buddha, only one Buddha at a time, the previous lives of the Buddha, the importance of gigantic stupas, and so on and so on. There's a number of things in common, but then there's a number of things that are not in common also. And it means that in thinking about this religious cultural tradition, we have to be kind of nuanced and faceted in our way of thinking. And so I hope you'll allow me to retitle the talk as the Pali Ikosa Dodecahedron rather than the Pali Sphere. Okay, thanks everybody.